My initial understanding of military drone warfare was via images of the Gulf War that were shown on TV news in the late 1990s. The images taken from the drones were black and white, bird's eye views, mostly of empty desert roads and small settlements. Often we were shown images of the drones tracking a missile to its target. Later in 2010, WikiLeaks released a classified, well-known US military video depicting the indiscriminate slaying of over a dozen people in the Iraqi suburb of New Baghdad. Here, a camera mounted on the helicopter's own gun sight mediated the scene to the helicopter crew, who, on viewing the image, conceptualized the enemy's intent, leading to a preemptive response. Military drone warfare also occurs through agency derived from interpreting mediated data and involves multiple sites. The actual site that the drone surveils and another site, a control center that is usually located far away from the theater of war. Here, ground-based drone pilots interpret streams of live data gathered by the drones in order to conceptualize the status of the targeted territory and to initiate actions according to that conceptualization. In this talk, I'll explore how this concept of a dual site is reflected in what's called the Nonsite artworks created in the 1960s and 1970s by the significant and influential American artist, Robert Smithson. When I visited Deer Beacon, a large contemporary art museum in upstate New York, I came across an artwork by Robert Smithson called Gravel Mirrors with Cracks and Dust. This is it here. I was immediately curious about the sculpture. It resembled an industrial operations panel. It also suggested to me drone warfare, and I wasn't immediately sure why at the time. Possibly though, it was because the mirrors reflected images of the gray concrete flooring that was desert-like. Robert Smithson created Gravel Mirrors with Cracks and Dust in 1968, some 30 years before drone images and conceptual understandings of their operational methods became part of public consciousness. As overt resemblances to military subject matter were a long way from Smithson's art-making concerns, I was surprised that the reference was so apparent to me in the artwork, and I decided to find out why. Attempt to. Smithson's mirrors don't address the viewer directly. Instead, they reflect back other parts of the gallery. While there was no frame around the artwork itself, the mirrors within the artwork framed reflections which appeared to originate from virtual spaces beyond the walls of the knowable exhibition space. Spatial ambiguity was compounded, for the mirrors were iteratively arranged, as though intended for multiple gazers, and their points of view offered inhuman perspectives. The mirrored reflections of the piles of gravel delineated and confused the boundary between these multiples of actual space and virtual space. The cracks, dust, and gravel referred to in the title of the work suggested dynamic and industrial processes. It was as though the materials evidenced the aftermath of forces that had played out, perhaps in the process of making the artwork. The segmented and repetitive forms and piles suggested multiple workstations with TV monitors, suggestive of systematic surveillance of the virtual spaces reflected in the mirrors. Smithson's Gravel Mirrors with Cracks and Dust was part of the emerging practice of land art in that period of time, emerging in the 1960s. Land art works were often sited in remote US desert locations and were quite hard for people to visit and view. Often huge in size, these works were often documented as artworks in galleries using collections of photographs and maps that served to mediate the remote site. Sometimes artists brought in rocks and other materials sourced from the landscape to create installations. These artworks then created a juxtaposition between the site of the gallery artwork and the original remote site. Smithson extensively explored the dialectic of these two sites, one local and one remote, in what he would call his non-site artworks. So the work inside the gallery was the non-site artwork. Many of the post-minimal and post-conceptual artworks at Deer Beacon and in general are placed directly on the floors and walls of the gallery, often occupying the same spatial boundaries as the visitor. This was quite a new and unusual development in the 1960s. Unlike traditional artworks whose framing serves to set art at a remove from the world, unframed minimalist artworks initiated connections by being in the space alongside us. Their theatrical situatedness implicated the visitor, the whole exhibition space, and by association, the world outside. While gravel mirrors with cracks and dust is not traditionally framed, it still designates expressive sites. These are iterative and reflected in the mirrors as virtual spaces. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari suggest that when designated by a boundary or limit, a territory that is framed becomes expressive. Deleuze and Guattari say that what defines a territory is the emergence of matters of expression, qualities. There is a territory precisely when milieu components cease to be functional to become expressive, end quote. Deleuze and Guattari suggest that framings of territory are also acts of art making by signaling expressive content to visitors who encounter the framed content. Smithson's silver-backed mirrors, for instance, were angled so that they didn't reflect and territorialize the image of the visitor. Instead, they deterritorialized the viewer's gaze, allowing the viewer to see and re-territorialize reflections of virtual spaces, which became expressive. Drone warfare involves similar acts of territorialization through the drone's framing of land or the drone operator's conceptual framing of territory through interpreting data. These territorializations also give rise to expressive spaces that provoke acts of retaliation against the perceived expressivity within the territory. The use of military force against the territory potentially breaks up or deterritorializes the remote site. Smithson's non-site artworks territorialize physiologically as well, employing artistic renderings of grids and structural overlays and rocks and materials, displaying samples of the rocks collected from remote sites, creating a dialectic between experience of those materials and the concept of site. His non-sites question the gallery's validity as a site. And as a visitor, I, for one, found myself questioning where the artwork actually was. The non-sites appear to be documenting and thus quantifying another site, but the artist also confuses through his paradoxical use of framings. Robert Smithson writes, the non-site itself tends to cancel out the actual site, although it's in the physical world, it's not there, end quote. Smithson sees boundaries and limits as contradictory thresholds. He observes which now is a prescient drone-like perspective that one is always crossing the horizon, yet it always remains distant. In his non-site artworks, boundaries coexist and overlay each other like the horizon, creating paradoxical dual unities. Site and non-site engage in a continual oscillation as their references swap or are shared between each other. Smithson's non-sites provide boundaries and limits, but no precise pointers. And so Smithson tells us that the site is evading you all the while it's directing you to it. Art can do these things. It can present antinomic framings that create ambiguity. this is what art does very well, as it gives the visitor, allows the visitor a space and a temporality that allows for the emergence of ideas. Smithson had a distrust of concepts. He says, quote, somehow to have something physical that generates ideas is more interesting to me than just an idea that might generate something physical, end quote. How then do my own imaginative thoughts of otherness and elsewhere that I experienced in viewing this work relate to the physical materials in my artwork encounter? I argue that within Smithson's artwork, I recognized physical adumbrations of structure that is currently in play in contemporary drone warfare. The most obvious correspondence is how Smithson's Nonsite artworks and drone warfare both rely on two sites, one the mediated site of conceptualization and the other the site of action. I also suggest that Smithson's physical structure embodies ideas of systems consciousness. Art critic Jack Burnham, writing in 1968, suggested that an artwork's temporality and its emerging theatricality could be considered preparatory steps towards the acceptance of a systems perspective. For Burnham, systems processes included notions of artworks that were no longer reliant on the static art object. He quote, these new systems prompt us not to look at the skin of objects, but at those meaningful relationships within and beyond their visible boundaries, end quote. The art object was to be replaced by a systems consciousness. Jack Burnham forecast that cybernetics would offer opportunities to explore artworks from the perspective of a systems consciousness beyond visible boundaries. Smithson himself was aware yet skeptical of systems theory, considering systems, quote, another abstract entity. If you make a system, you can be sure the system is bound to evade itself. So I can see no point in pinning any hopes on systems, end quote.
David, just to let you know, there's about 2 minutes left, so.
Thanks. Which is not to say that Smithson didn't deliberately incorporate aspects of systems methodology within his artworks. I suggest that systematic and cybernetic regulatory frameworks adumbrated within Smithson's Nonsites have become accessible to the contemporary viewer who is attuned to recognizing the structure of these systems that have become embedded in our engagement with the everyday. In a cybernetic system, feedback loops consistently present past outcomes as a means to govern the present moment and its futurity. My encounter with gravel, mirrors, and cracks and dust also involved regulatory aspects in which my experience and conception of the non-site informed my attempts to conceive of and experience or imagine another remote or non-existent site. As a visitor to gravel, mirrors, cracks and dust, I experienced a suspension of temporality and spatiality within what can be described as a cybernetic oscillation of reference and control, where one site is referencing and controlling the other. Smithson suggests the sites are receding into the non-sites and the non-sites are receding back into the sites. It's always back and forth. Experiential contradictions and paradoxes render this negotiation simultaneously frustrating and fascinating, as Smithson's framings, instead of seeking the absolutes necessary for drone warfare decision-making, instead remain open to becomings of active thought. While Smithson's version of cybernetic systems is inherently flawed, it is in keeping with his desire to employ both concepts and sensations, but to evade conceptual closure. Smithson's non-sites, through their perceptual and conceptual paradoxes, ultimately subvert the ideas of systems. To briefly conclude, I see a distinct parallel between drone warfare's methodology and Smithson's site and non-site dialectic. Both drone warfare and Smithson's notion of non-site and site make use of systems theory to regulate a site through non-site correlations. The difference is that in warfare, this regulation is used to reconnoiter, verify, and curate the remote site through actions. With Smithson systems, these are employed to set up expectations of correlations that are ultimately thwarted by his antonymic framings. Thank you.